Disclaimer: this is a fictional dramatization created for artistic, emotional, and educational storytelling purposes. All characters and events are entirely fictional and created using AI tools. No impersonation, misrepresentation, or harm is intended. The content contains scenes of danger involving child characters. However, no real persons or minors were involved in its production. Grace's Love Stories produces scripted, AI-generated stories that promote, entertain, inspire kindness, and emotional connection. We respect our viewers and strictly adhere to YouTube's policies.
The scent of him was wrong. It wasn't the familiar aroma of pine and damp earth that she had memorized since childhood, the scent that was supposed to be hers alone. It was tainted, corrupted by the cloying sweetness of night-blooming jasmine, the signature scent of Lyra, the pack's most coveted beta. The bonfire crackled, spitting embers into the chilled autumn air, but a colder frost was creeping through Celine's veins. Laughter and the triumphant howls of the annual hunt echoed around her, but all she could hear was the frantic, panicked thrumming of her own heart. She was a ghost at her own funeral, invisible until the moment of her execution. The whispers had followed her all evening, sticky and cruel as cobwebs. Wolfless Omega, a hollow shell. How can she possibly anchor an alpha like Ronan? She had ignored them, lifting her chin and clinging to the fragile promise of the mate bond, the one sacred thread the goddess was said to grant to every shifter. It was supposed to be unbreakable, her salvation. But as she rounded the great oak that marked the edge of the clearing, she saw the truth of her worth. He was pressed against the ancient bark, his powerful form caging the slender, eager body of the other she-wolf. His hands, the same hands that had cupped her face just this morning and promised her forever, were tangled in Lyra's silver hair, and he was kissing her. A deep, possessive kiss that staked a claim Celine had only ever dreamed of. The sacred bond in her chest didn't just crack. It violently shattered, sending shards of ice and fire through every nerve. She felt it as a physical tearing, a howl of phantom pain from the wolf she didn't have. And in that moment, she knew this humiliation was not just an accident. It was a statement. Ronan pulled back, his breathing ragged. He saw her then. His blue eyes, once the color of a summer sky, hardened into chips of ice. There was no remorse, no shock, only a cold, dismissive cruelty. Lyra's lips curved into a triumphant smirk, her gaze sweeping over Celine's simple wool dress with open contempt. "Celine Piquant," Ronan said, his voice flat. He didn't bother to disentangle himself from Lyra, who practically purred, rubbing her cheek against his chest and marking him again with her scent. The sound of her name from his lips was acid. The pack, drawn by the sudden suffocating silence that had fallen over the clearing, began to turn. Faces emerged from the firelight, eyes wide with morbid curiosity. The whispers grew louder, bolder. "Ronan?" The word was a broken thing, a wisp of sound stolen by the wind. She could feel the mate bond, or what was left of it, writhing in her soul, a dying serpent poisoning her from the inside. The pain was excruciating, a constant, sharp pressure behind her ribs. "This isn't working," he stated, his words as clean and sharp as a butcher's knife. "I need a real mate. A strong alpha needs a she-wolf who can run at his side, not this." He gestured vaguely at her, a motion that encompassed her entire being, her lack of a wolf, her omega status, her quiet nature. He was dismissing her entire existence. Lyra giggled, a sound like tiny, malicious bells. "He needs a wolf who can give him heirs, Celine. Strong, alpha-blooded pups. Not barren heir." The word hit her like a physical blow. Barren. It was the pack's deepest shame, the ultimate failure for a she-wolf. Without a wolf of her own, her body was considered an empty vessel, incapable of carrying the next generation of shifters. It was a biological reality she had tried to ignore, a flaw Ronan had once sworn he didn't care about. You promised," she whispered, her hands trembling at her sides. She felt the eyes of the entire Blackwood pack on her, their pity a thick, suffocating blanket. She saw the elders turning away in disgust, the younger wolves snickering behind their hands. She was a spectacle, a broken toy being publicly discarded. Ronan finally pushed Lyra away gently, stepping forward. For a terrifying second, She thought he might show a flicker of the man she loved, a hint of regret. She was wrong. He reached out and grabbed her wrist, his grip hard and unforgiving. He pulled her hand up, revealing the faint silvery mark of their pre-bond, shimmering on her skin like a brand of shame. "I reject this bond," he declared, his voice ringing with the formal power of his alpha blood. "I, Ronan of the Blackwood Pack, sever all ties to Celine Marrow. She is no mate of mine. She is wolfless. She is barren. She is nothing." The pain that ripped through her was blinding. It was worse than the shattering. This was the final, deliberate twisting of the blade. The silver mark on her wrist flared with white-hot agony, before dissolving into nothing, leaving behind an angry red patch of skin that felt scoured raw. The phantom limb of their connection was not just broken, it was amputated without anesthetic. A scream built in her throat, but it wouldn't come out. She was mute with agony, drowning in a sea of contemptuous faces. He released her, and she stumbled back, her legs failing her. She didn't fall. A worse fate awaited her. As Ronan turned and draped his arm around Lyra, pulling her back toward the warmth and celebration of the bonfire, the pack parted for them. Then they closed ranks, turning their backs on Celine. One by one, they turned away, leaving her utterly alone in the cold darkness at the edge of the clearing. The message was clear. She was no longer one of them. She was an outcast. Nothing. Something inside her snapped. It wasn't logic, it wasn't reason. It was pure, primal survival. The lingering echo of the bond, even severed, was a torment she could not endure. It was a ghost haunting her blood, a constant reminder of her failure. She had heard whispers of the old ways, of dark, desperate magic. A taboo ritual to erase the scar of a broken, fated bond. You couldn't just cut the thread. You had to burn it away completely, cauterize the wound by binding yourself, however briefly, to another. It had to be immediate, before the scar tissue of rejection formed in the soul. It was madness, a reckless act that spit in the face of the goddess. And it was the only thing she could think of. Without a backward glance at the pack that had discarded her, she turned and fled. She ran, heedless of the branches that tore at her dress and scratched her skin. The forest floor was a treacherous carpet of roots and stones. But she didn't slow. She ran from the laughter, from the pity, from the ghost of Ronan's touch. She ran until her lungs burned and her vision blurred with tears of rage and pain. She crossed the scent-marked border of her own territory, plunging into the neutral lands that lay between the territories of the Great Packs, a lawless stretch of woods where anything could happen. Her frantic flight led her to a place she had been warned about her entire life, the halfway house. It was a rugged, timber-framed tavern that catered to rogues, travelers, and exiles. Smoke curled from its chimney, a grimy plume against the pristine moonlit sky. The air here was a chaotic mess of scents, strange wolves, stale ale, desperation, and danger. But it was far from Ronan, and that was all that mattered. Pushing through the heavy oak door, she stumbled into a wall of sound and heat. The place was crowded, filled with grim-faced shifters whose eyes held the hard glint of survival. They looked up as she entered, their conversations dying down. They smelled the Blackwood Pack on her, but they also smelled her distress, the raw, open wound of her rejection. A few sneered, others looked away, uninterested in another's misery. Her eyes scanned the room, searching for, she didn't even know what. An anchor, a weapon, a fire to fight fire. And then she saw him. He was sitting in the darkest corner of the room, alone at a heavy wooden table. The shadows seemed to cling to him, to obey him. He was large, built on a scale that made the other formidable shifters in the room look like ordinary men. A dark hooded cloak obscured his features, but she could feel the sheer, crushing weight of his presence. It was a physical force, an aura of silent, absolute power that bent the very atmosphere of the tavern around him. The boisterous noise of the room did not touch his corner. A bubble of profound silence surrounded him. His scent cut through the chaotic miasma of the tavern like a bolt of lightning. It was ancient and wild, the smell of ozone after a storm, of deep, cold earth, and the sharp, clean scent of a mountain peak where the air was thin and merciless. It was a scent of dominance, of solitude, of kings. Driven by an impulse she couldn't name, Celine moved toward him. The other patrons shifted out of her way, their eyes following her with a mixture of fear and awe. as if she were walking willingly into a predator's den. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror and sheer desperate will. She stopped before his table. He didn't look up. A half-empty glass of amber liquid sat before one of his large, gloved hands. Her voice was a dry rasp. She swallowed, forcing the words out. I need your help. He remained perfectly still. She could feel his gaze on her from beneath the deep cowl of his hood, an intense, unnerving weight. It wasn't a look of lust or curiosity. It felt older, heavier, as if he were weighing her soul. I need you to bind with me, she whispered, the words tasting like ash and shame. Just for tonight, a temporary bond, to sever another. A low murmur rippled through the tavern. To ask such a thing of a stranger was unheard of, a grave insult or a suicidal plea. Binding was sacred, even a temporary one. She was offering her neck, her blood, her very essence to an unknown wolf. The stranger finally moved. He lifted his head slowly, and the shadows seemed to part for him. She still couldn't see his face clearly, only the strong line of a jaw shadowed with stubble, and a mouth set in a hard, unreadable line. But she saw his eyes. They glowed with a soft internal light, the color of molten gold. They were the eyes of a wolf so powerful, so old, that his human form could barely contain the beast within. He said nothing. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. The pain of Ronan's rejection was a screaming phantom in her skull, and she swayed on her feet, dizzy with it. Please, she begged, placing a trembling hand on the edge of his table. I will give you anything. His golden eyes held hers. A deep, resonant sound rumbled in his chest, less a word and more the feeling of a distant earthquake. Anything? His voice was a low gravel, a sound that vibrated not in her ears but deep in her bones. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. With a fluid grace that was terrifying in a man his size, he rose. He towered over her, a mountain of shadow and power. He reached out, his gloved hand gently taking her chin, tilting her face up to the dim light. His touch was surprisingly careful, yet it sent a jolt of raw energy through her, silencing the last vestiges of Ronan's ghost. He studied her face, his gilded gaze tracing her tear-stained cheeks, her trembling lips, the abject desperation in her eyes. He leaned down, his voice a breath against her ear, meant for her alone. You are asking to trade a dog for a dragon, little one. Are you certain? She didn't understand his words, but she understood the choice. Annihilation or this. She gave another desperate, jerky nod. He let out a soft, humorless sound that might have been a chuckle. Very well. He lowered his head to the side of her neck. She flinched, her body screaming at her to run, but she held herself rigid. This was her choice, her pyre. She closed her eyes, bracing for pain. She felt the ghost of a touch, his lips brushing her skin, and then the sharp, piercing sting as his canines sank into the sensitive flesh just above her pulse point. The pain was electric, but it was the power that followed that stole her breath. It was not the familiar, earthy energy of a pack wolf. This was a torrent, a tidal wave of ancient, untamed magic that flooded her system. It was cold as the void between stars, and hot as a forge's heart. It roared through her veins, a cleansing fire that vaporized every last trace of Ronan's touch, his scent, his memory. It burned away the broken bond, the shame, the rejection, leaving nothing but the overwhelming, terrifying reality of the man holding her. The world tilted on its axis, the sounds of the tavern fading into a distant hum. The last thing she felt was his arm sliding around her waist, holding her up as her knees buckled. The last thing she heard was a low, possessive growl that rumbled through his chest and into hers, a sound that promised not freedom, but a far more dangerous form of captivity. Her senses dissolved into the all-encompassing scent of storm and stone, and then only darkness. The first thing she noticed was the silence. It was not the gentle quiet of the forest, filled with the whisper of leaves and the breath of sleeping things, but a deep, profound stillness that seemed to absorb all sound. It was the silence of stone and immense space, heavy and ancient. The second thing was the scent. The chaotic, sour miasma of the tavern was gone. In its place was the clean, sharp fragrance of beeswax, dried herbs, and overlying it all, that same impossible scent from the stranger. ozone after a lightning strike, cold mountain stone, and a hint of something wild and deeply masculine that seemed to settle directly into her bones. Celine's eyes fluttered open. She was not on the dirt floor of a tavern. She was lying on a mattress so soft it felt like sinking into a cloud, covered by sheets that were not coarse wool or rough-spun linen, but silk. Cool, heavy, and impossibly smooth against her skin. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her. She sat up in a rush, the silken sheet pooling around her waist. She was still in her torn, grimy dress from the night before, a stark, pathetic contrast to the opulence surrounding her. The room was vast, larger than the entire communal hall of her Pax Lodge. The walls were dark, polished stone, hung with heavy tapestries depicting epic hunts and ancient battles. A colossal fireplace, large enough for a man to stand in, took up one wall, a low fire crackling merrily within its hearth, casting flickering golden light across the space. The floor was covered in thick, dark furs, and the furniture was made of a dark, almost black wood, carved with intricate knots and beasts. Towering windows, framed in heavy velvet curtains, revealed a sky still bruised with the dark purples of pre-dawn. This was a place of immense wealth and power. Her hand flew to her neck, to the place where the stranger had bitten her. Her fingers met a mark, not a scabbed-over wound, but a pattern of raised, smooth skin, like an intricate scar. It tingled with a steady, low-level energy, a hum that resonated deep within her chest. It was the source of the quiet thrum of power she felt coursing through her. The ghost of Ronan was gone. The gaping wound in her soul had been filled, not healed, but occupied by this new, formidable presence. It was like trading a festering wound for a collar and chain. "You are awake," the voice came from the shadows near the fireplace. It was the same low, gravelly timbre that had vibrated through her bones in the tavern, the voice of the dragon. Celine's head snapped toward the sound, her heart leaping into her throat. He stepped out of the shadows and into the firelight. The hooded cloak was gone, and the sight of him stole the air from her lungs. He was a king carved from the very mountain his scent evoked. Taller and broader than she had realized, his shoulders were a solid line of power beneath a simple black tunic. His dark hair was long, threaded with a few strands of silver at the temples, and tied back from a face that was all harsh angles and brutal experience. It was not a handsome face in the way Ronan's had been. Ronan was the polished beauty of a summer day. This man was the raw, breathtaking majesty of a winter storm. A jagged scar ran from his right temple down across his cheekbone, disappearing into the line of his dark stubble. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were the same molten gold, glowing with their own internal light, intelligent, ancient, and utterly merciless. They watched her not with heat or lust, but with the calm, assessing patience of a predator that knows its prey is already caught. Who are you?" she breathed, pulling the silk sheet up to her chin like a shield. He moved toward the bed, his footsteps utterly silent on the fur rugs. He stopped a few feet away, a respectful distance that somehow felt more intimidating than aggression. It bespoke a confidence so absolute he had no need for overt threats. "I am the man whose help you begged for," he said, his voice a low rumble, "the stranger to whom you offered anything." He let the word hang in the air between them, heavy with implication. Celine flinched, the shame of her desperation washing over her. It was meant to be a temporary bond, a ritual to sever my previous one. "It's over now. I can leave." She started to push herself off the bed, her mind racing. She needed to get back to the woods, to disappear. "No!" The single word was not a shout, but it hit her with the force of a physical blow. It was a statement of absolute, unarguable fact. Her muscles froze. "The bond you initiated was not a simple tavern ritual, little one," he continued, his golden eyes never leaving hers. "You took a spark to burn away a splinter, but you placed that spark in the hands of an inferno. The bond holds. My wolf has accepted it. He has accepted you." Her blood ran cold. "Your wolf? But no one's wolf would accept a wolfless Omega. A barren she-wolf." The words were a bitter poison on her tongue, the insults Ronan had used to discard her. A flicker of something dangerous sparked in his eyes. "My wolf is not like those of lesser alphas. He does not care for the mewling politics of pack status. He cares for strength, and he senses a strength in you that you do not even know you possess. He took another step closer. As for who I am Kelric Daymar. The name meant nothing to her at first. It was just a name. But then fragmented whispers from traveling merchants and fearful elders pieced themselves together in her mind. Daymar, the name of the royal line. Kelric, the Alpha King, the reclusive, brutal monarch of all the northern territories. A king so powerful and feared that other alphas were said to tremble when his patrols crossed their lands. The wolf who had ruled for 50 years without a mate, without a queen, rejecting every high-born she-wolf presented to him. The one whose throne had remained cold through every season, until now. Celine felt the world tilt. The silk sheet suddenly felt like a shroud. The luxurious room became a cage. She had run from the cruelty of a pack alpha and thrown herself into the den of the alpha of alphas. No, she whispered, shaking her head in denial. It can't be. You're the king. It was an accusation, a plea, a whimper of pure terror. I am, he confirmed, his expression unchanging. And by the old law, a bond freely offered and accepted by the Alpha King is not temporary. It is absolute. You are bound to me, Celine of the Blackwood Pack. I am not of the Blackwood Pack, she snapped, a flare of her old pain rising. They cast me out. They did, he agreed, his gaze softening almost imperceptibly. And in their foolishness, they discarded a treasure they were not worthy of. Their loss. He paused, his eyes sweeping over her, from her disheveled hair to her bare feet peeking out from under the hem of her ruined dress. You have a new pack now. You have a new alpha. You are here, under my protection. Protection? She laughed, a broken, hysterical sound. This isn't protection, this is a prison. A gilded one, perhaps, he conceded with a slight, humorless tilt of his lips. But a prison is meant to hold someone against their will. I am not holding you. The bond is, a bond you sought. He was right. The logic was as cold and inescapable as the stone walls around her. This was a cage of her own making. The weight of her impulsive, desperate act crashed down on her. She had traded public humiliation for royal imprisonment. A servant, a woman with graying hair and a stern, but not unkind face, entered silently, carrying a tray. She set it down on a table near the fire, not daring to look at the king, and bowed her head to Celine before backing out of the room. On the tray was a steaming pot of tea, fresh bread, cheese, and fruit. The smell made Celine's empty stomach clench with a hunger she hadn't realized she felt. Eat, Kelric commanded gently. You collapsed from exhaustion and pain. You need your strength. She eyed the food, then him. I'm not hungry. It was a childish act of defiance, the only power she had left. Kelric's jaw tightened slightly. He walked to the tray, poured a cup of tea, and brought it to her. He didn't offer it. He simply stood beside the bed, holding it, waiting. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the frantic beating of her own heart. The aroma of the herbal tea was calming, and despite herself, her throat was painfully dry. Defeated, she finally reached out a trembling hand and took the warm ceramic cup. Her fingers brushed his, and a jolt, a current of pure energy shot up her arm. It was startlingly intimate, a stark reminder of the physical connection that now existed between them. She took a sip, the warm liquid a small comfort in the overwhelming chaos of her reality. What do you want from me? She asked, her voice small. He watched her for a long moment before answering, his golden eyes searching her face. For now, I want you to rest, to heal, to understand that the world that hurt you can no longer touch you here. His voice was low, hypnotic. Ronan of the Blackwood cannot touch you, Lyra cannot mock you. The pack that turned its back on you is nothing more than a bad memory. Here you are safe. The word safe was so foreign, so deeply craved, that it almost broke her, but she wouldn't let it. She wouldn't trade one form of weakness for another. And after that, she pressed, when I'm healed, am I to be your pet, your Omega slave in a castle? A low growl rumbled in Kelric's chest, a sound of pure, undiluted fury that made the very air vibrate. The cup in her hand rattled. The predator was there, just beneath the surface of the calm, civilized king. You will never be a slave, he bit out, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. His golden eyes flared. You are the mate of the Alpha King. You bear my mark. Anyone who dares to show you disrespect will answer to me with their life. You do not understand what you have done, Celine. You have bound yourself not just to a man, but to a throne, to a crown. He reached out, his hand moving with slow, deliberate purpose. He gently cupped her jaw, his thumb stroking the line of her cheek. His touch was not forceful, but it radiated a power that left no room for argument. She could feel the rough calluses on his palm, the immense strength held in careful check. I have spent a lifetime ensuring no bond could be forced upon me, that no political alliance could chain my wolf, he murmured, his gaze intense, almost feral. I swore I would never take a mate. I built a fortress of solitude around this throne. And then you, a broken little bird with a storm in your heart, walked into a rogue's tavern and tore it all down with a single desperate plea. He leaned closer, his scent enveloping her, intoxicating and terrifying. You are not my prisoner, he whispered, his breath warm against her skin. You are my queen. The words hung in the air, a pronouncement, a prophecy, a death sentence. Before she could process their impossible weight, the great wooden doors to the chamber swung open. A man in the formal attire of a royal advisor stood there, his face pale and etched with worry. Your Majesty, the man said, his voice trembling slightly as he bowed low. Forgive the intrusion, but the news has spread. The scent of the royal bond is on the wind. The council has been convened. They demand to see her. Kaelric did not turn to face the advisor. His molten gold eyes remained locked on Celine, but the warmth, if it could even be called that, had vanished, replaced by the chilling glint of a monarch interrupted. A low, dangerous growl rumbled in his chest, a sound that made the very stones of the castle seem to vibrate. The advisor, a silver-haired wolf named Lord Valerius, flinched as if struck, his head bowing even lower. They demand? Kaelric's voice was deceptively soft, yet it carried the sharp edge of honed steel. The temperature in the room seemed to drop by 10 degrees. Forgive my wording, Your Majesty, Valerius stammered, his gaze fixed firmly on the floor. They urgently request an audience. The alphas of the inner circle are gathering. They say a bond with an unknown is a threat to the stability of the northern territories. The unspoken insult hung in the air, thick and suffocating, a bond with a wolfless Omega. A nobody, Celine shrank back against the headboard, the silk sheets a flimsy barrier against the crushing weight of royal politics. She had traded the judgment of a pack for the judgment of an entire kingdom. The firelight glinted off the raised mark on her neck, and she felt a sudden phantom itch, as if the brand was burning anew under the scrutiny of unseen, hostile eyes. Kaelric's thumb stroked her jaw once more, a possessive, grounding gesture, before he finally pulled his hand away. He turned his head slowly, fixing Valerius with a look of such cold, absolute authority that the old wolf visibly paled. The stability of my territories is my concern, Valerius, not theirs. I have ruled for 50 years without their counsel on matters of the throne, and I will not begin seeking it now. Tell the council I will meet them at midday. Not before. But, Your Majesty, they are insisting, and I am commanding, Kaelric cut him off, his voice dropping into a register of pure, unassailable power. The Alpha King's command. It was a force of nature, a thing that could not be defied. Valerius's mouth snapped shut with an audible click. He bowed so low his forehead nearly touched his knees. As you command, Your Majesty. He then risked a fleeting, fearful glance at Celine, his eyes full of a mixture of pity and terror, before backing out of the room, pulling the heavy doors shut behind him. The silence that fell was more profound than before, charged with tension. Celine's hands were trembling, rattling the teacup she still held. She set it down on the bedside table with a clatter. They want to see the freak, she said, the words brittle. The wolfless Omega who dared to taint their precious royal bloodline. Kaelric turned back to her, and the glacial fury in his eyes had been replaced by something else, something complex and unreadable. They want to see the woman who accomplished what no alpha's daughter, no diplomat's niece, and no warrior maiden ever could. They want to see the one who holds my bond. They want to destroy me, she countered, her voice shaking, just like my pack did. He moved to the foot of the bed, his presence dominating the vast chamber. Let them try. The words were a vow, a promise of violence so profound it made her shiver. The woman who wears my mark is not to be judged by a council of posturing alphas. She is to be revered. He gestured to a large carved wardrobe against the far wall. Ilara, the servant who brought you food, has laid out clothes for you. Bathe, dress, eat. I will return for you before midday. He started toward the door, a walking storm of contained power. Wait, she called out, her voice stronger than she expected. He paused, his hand on the iron latch, and looked back at her over his shoulder. Why? She asked, the question raw and desperate. Why me? You could have refused. You could have pushed me away. You're the Alpha King. Why would your wolf accept a bond with nothing? Calric was silent for a long moment, his broad back to her. The firelight danced across the powerful muscles beneath his tunic. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, stripped of the royal command, leaving something deeper and more personal in its place. Because for the first time in a century, he said, his voice a low, rough murmur, my wolf was not met with ambition, not with lust for power or greed for a crown. He was met with pure, honest desperation, with pain that mirrored his own solitude. He looked at you and did not see an Omega. He saw a survivor, and he recognized a kindred soul. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. He swept from the room, the doors closing behind him with a heavy, final thud. Left alone in the echoing silence, his words replayed in her mind, pain that mirrored his own solitude. The ruthless, untouchable Alpha King was lonely? The idea was so preposterous, so contrary to the myth of the man, that she couldn't fully grasp it. Shakily, Celine slid from the bed. Her legs were weak, but she forced herself to stand. She walked to the window, pushing aside the heavy velvet curtain. Below, a sprawling courtyard of gray stone was already bustling with activity. Guards in dark armor bearing the crest of a snarling wolf's head patrolled the battlements. Shifters of all ranks hurried across the stone, their expressions grim and purposeful. This was not just a castle, it was a fortress, the heart of a military power, and she was trapped within it. Turning from the window, she saw a smaller door she hadn't noticed before. Pushing it open, she found a bathing chamber that rivaled the main room in its luxury. A sunken tub, carved from a single piece of black marble, was already steaming, the water scented with lavender and salt. Clean, soft towels were stacked nearby, along with unscented soaps and oils. The sheer, thoughtless opulence was jarring, a stark contrast to the communal, functional washing rooms of her pack. There, water was heated over a fire and shared. Here, a private, steaming bath awaited her, as if by magic. She stripped off her ruined dress, the symbol of her old life and public humiliation, and let it fall to the floor. Stepping into the hot water, a shudder of relief went through her. The heat soothed her aching muscles and the stinging cuts from her flight through the forest. As she washed away the grime and the lingering scent of the tavern, she felt as though she were trying to wash away the last 24 hours, to scrub the memory of Ronan's betrayal and the pack's scorn from her very skin. But she couldn't. The mark on her neck remained, a permanent, tingling reminder. It was not just a symbol of her bond to Calric, it was a brand of her own desperation. After bathing, she found the clothes Ilara had laid out. It was not a grand dress for a queen, but a simple, practical tunic of soft, dark green wool, worn over linen trousers. It was clothing for function, not display, and she was grateful for it. Dressing, she felt a sliver of her own identity return. She ate the bread and cheese, the simple act of nourishing her body, a small rebellion against the overwhelming fear. With each bite, she felt a little stronger, a little more grounded. When Calric returned, he found her standing by the fire, her back straight, her hands clasped behind her. She had brushed out her long, dark hair, and it hung like a silken curtain down her back. She looked less like a frightened victim and more like a woman steeling herself for a coming battle. He stopped, his golden eyes sweeping over her, an unreadable emotion flickering in their depths. He too had changed. He now wore a tunic of black leather, reinforced with plates of gleaming steel at the shoulders and chest. A heavy sword with a wolf's head pommel was belted at his hip. He was not dressed for a council meeting. He was dressed for war. "You are ready," he stated. It was not a question. "I am not one of your subjects to be presented for approval," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I will not be paraded before them like a prize sow at market." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Good, that is the spirit my wolf saw. You will not be presented. You will be introduced. There is a difference." He held out his arm to her. "They will not see a weak Omega. They will see the chosen mate of their king. Walk beside me, Celine. Lift your head, and do not, under any circumstances, show them your fear." His arm was solid as oak. Hesitantly, she placed her hand on his forearm. The moment she touched him, the bond flared, a current of warmth and raw power that flowed from him into her. It was a jolt of pure strength, steadying her trembling knees, chasing away the worst of the cold dread in her stomach. It felt like borrowing his courage. Together, they walked out of the chamber and into the great stone halls of the fortress. Guards snapped to attention as they passed, their fists striking their chests in a salute of loyalty. Their gazes flickered to Celine, wide with shock and curiosity, but none dared to stare. Caelric's pace was long and purposeful, and she had to hurry to keep up, but he never pulled ahead, keeping her firmly at his side. The message was clear to all who saw them. She was with him. She was his. They arrived before a set of immense iron-bound doors, twice the height of a man. 2 guards, clad in full-plate armor, pulled them open, revealing the council chamber. It was a cavernous, circular room, dominated by a massive round table carved from a single, petrified weirwood tree. The air was thick with the aggressive, territorial sense of powerful alphas. At least 20 of them were gathered there, the leaders of the most powerful packs in the north. They were massive, scarred warriors, men who had carved their domains out of the wilderness and held them with brute force and cunning. They all rose as Caelric entered, their expressions a mixture of grudging respect and open hostility. Their collective gaze fell upon Celine, and the force of it was like a physical blow. She could feel their appraisal, their shock, their immediate, visceral dismissal. She smelled their contempt. Wolfless, weak, unworthy. She faltered, her hand tightening on Caelric's arm, her instinct screaming at her to flee. But his arm was an immovable anchor. He didn't even glance at her. His golden eyes swept the room, meeting the gaze of every alpha there, challenging them, daring them. "You requested an audience," Caelric's voice boomed, silencing the murmurs that had begun to ripple through the chamber. "You have it." An old barrel-chested alpha with a thick gray beard and a network of scars on his face stepped forward. His scent was of frost and old blood. This was Lord Boren of the Frostfang Pack, the most ancient and influential of the clans. "Caelric," he began, foregoing the royal title in a deliberate show of defiance. "We come to you as brothers concerned for the throne. For 50 years, you have stood alone, a bastion of strength. Now this. You have bonded with an outsider, a stray." His eyes flicked to Celine with undisguised disgust. "She carries no pack scent of worth, no wolf spirit. She is a hollow vessel. This bond is a mockery. It weakens you. It weakens us all. You must set her aside." A chorus of growled agreements echoed around the table. Celine's breath hitched. Set her aside. Just like Ronan had. Discarded. Thrown away. The same words, the same judgment, just on a grander scale. Caelric's hand moved from under hers, his arm wrapping around her waist, pulling her flush against his side. It was a possessive, unequivocal gesture of claiming. He turned his head, his lips brushing her temple as he spoke, his voice a low, intimate murmur meant only for her, yet loud enough for the room to hear. "Do you see that old fool, Celine?" he whispered, his breath a warm caress. "He thinks power lies in bloodlines and the strength of the wolf. He is wrong." Then he raised his voice, addressing the entire council, his golden eyes blazing with a fire that seemed to suck the very air from the room. "This is Celine Daymar," he declared, his voice ringing with the power of the mountain. "She is not a stray. She is not a hollow vessel. She is my mate, my queen. The bond is done. It is recognized by the old magic, and it is recognized by my wolf." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Her strength is not the loud, brutish howl of a common wolf. It is the quiet, enduring strength of the mountain itself, the strength to survive, the strength to choose her own fate, a strength none of you have ever had to learn. He looked down at her, and for the first time, she saw something beyond power and solitude in his eyes. It was a fierce, burning protectiveness, a raw possessiveness, an emotion so primal it transcended the politics of the room. "Her word," he announced, his gaze sweeping the stunned faces of the alphas, "is now my word. Her safety is the safety of the throne, and the first of you to show her anything less than the absolute reverence due a queen." He let the threat hang in the air, unfinished but perfectly understood. He didn't need to finish it. The promise of violence was a living thing in the room. He then looked directly at Lord Bourne, a cold, predatory smile touching his lips. "You wish for me to set her aside? Then come, old friend. Come and try to take her from me." The silence in the council chamber was absolute, heavy, and sharp as a shard of ice. Lord Bourne's face, already weathered and grim, hardened into a mask of furious granite. The air crackled, thick with the scent of enraged alphas, a volatile mix of ozone, bloodlust, and wounded pride. Celine could feel the combined pressure of their wills pressing in on her, a suffocating psychic weight designed to make a lesser wolf grovel. Her knees felt weak, and the primal omega instinct to submit, to make herself small and unthreatening, surged through her. But Kaelric's arm was a band of steel around her waist, an anchor in the storm. The bond, their bond, pulsed between them, a silent, thrumming current. Through it, she felt not his anger, but his unwavering certainty. It flowed into her, a strange and potent transfusion of courage. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and met Boren's hateful glare with a stillness she hadn't known she possessed. She had already faced the utter destruction of her world. What more could this council of overgrown, snarling brutes do to her? Boren took a half-step forward, his massive hands clenching into fists at his sides. A low, guttural growl escaped his throat, a sound that promised snapped bones and torn flesh. "You would choose this shell over the loyalty of your pack alphas? Over the security of the North? This is madness, Kaelric. It is a weakness she has poisoned you with." "The only poison in this room, Boren, is your ambition," Kaelric countered, his voice dropping to a lethally calm register. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The quiet menace in his tone was more terrifying than any shout. "You have coveted my throne for decades, hiding behind a veneer of loyalty. You see this not as a weakness in me, but as an opportunity for you. Do you think I am blind?" He took a deliberate step forward, pulling Celine with him, placing her slightly behind him in a classic gesture of protection that was both primal and infuriatingly possessive. "You will address her as your majesty, and you will retract your insult. Now." Boren's face purpled with rage. To be dressed down so publicly, to be commanded to apologize to a wolfless Omega, it was an unthinkable humiliation. "I will not," he snarled. "I answer to the ancient laws of the Pax, not to the whims of a king bewitched by a baron." He never finished the word. Kaelric moved. It wasn't the clumsy charge of an angry brawler. It was an explosion of motion, a blur of black leather and steel so swift it seemed to defy physics. One moment he was standing beside Celine, the next he was across the room, his hand clamped around Boren's throat, lifting the massive alpha clear off the ground. Boren's feet kicked uselessly in the air. The other alphas stumbled back, their sense turning from aggression to shock and raw fear. Kaelric's golden eyes burned with a light that was no longer human. It was the pure predatory fire of the ancient beast within him, fully unleashed. He slammed Boren back against the stone wall, the impact echoing like a thunderclap. Cracks spiderwebbed through the stone around the old alpha's head. "You have forgotten your place," Kaelric hissed, his voice a low, terrifying vibration that seemed to come from the depths of the earth. "You have forgotten who sits on the throne of the North. You have forgotten who culled the wild packs of the Frozen Spine, and who broke the armies of the Southern Sun worshippers. Allow me to remind you." He squeezed. Boren's face went from purple to a ghastly blue, his eyes bulging. His hands clawed weakly at the unyielding grip on his throat. The scent of his terror, sharp and acrid, filled the chamber. Celine watched, her heart hammering against her ribs. Part of her was horrified by the brutal, swift violence, but another, deeper part of her, a part she didn't recognize, felt a dark, vicious thrill. For the first time in her life, someone was fighting for her. For the first time, an insult hurled at her was not met with her own silent shame, but with the righteous, terrifying fury of a king. The power she had felt in him, the raw force that had flooded her during their bonding, was now on full display. It was a terrifying, beautiful, and utterly seductive sight. "My mate's honor is my honor," Kaelric growled, his face inches from Boren's. "Her name is my name. Your insult to her is treason, and the penalty for treason is death. He was going to kill him, right here. He was going to snap his neck in front of the entire council. A collective gasp went through the room. This was more than a display of dominance. This was the tearing up of old alliances, the forging of a new, terrifying order. Stop. The word was quiet, almost a whisper, but in the suffocating silence, it rang out like a bell. Kaelric froze. His head turned slowly, his molten eyes still blazing with the fury of his wolf, finding her. He was still holding Boren, whose life was literally hanging by a thread. Celine stepped forward, her legs shaking but holding steady. Every eye in the room swiveled to her. She was the center of it all, the cause. And now, perhaps, the only solution. Let him go, she said, her voice finding a strange, quiet strength. Kaelric's jaw tightened. A low growl rumbled in his chest, a sound of protest from the beast that wanted blood. He dishonored you, and you have answered his dishonor, she said. Walking closer until she stood just beside him, she could feel the heat rolling off his body, the thrumming, violent energy of his barely contained wolf. She reached out, her hand trembling, and placed it on his arm, the one holding Boren aloft. His muscle was like forged iron beneath her touch. You have shown them your strength. Now, show them your mercy. A king who kills for an insult is a tyrant. A king who offers mercy for a queen's sake is a ruler. The words came from a place she didn't know she had. A well of instinct and observation from years of watching pack politics from the shadows. She had always been invisible, a listener, a watcher. She had seen how true power was wielded, not just with brute force, but with calculated grace. Kaelric's gaze searched hers, the feral light in his eyes warring with the cold intelligence of the monarch. The bond between them hummed, a conduit for more than just power. He felt her fear, yes, but he also felt her resolve. He felt her plea not for Boren's life, but for his own reign. She was not asking him to be weak. She was asking him to be wise. Slowly, agonizingly, the tension in his arm eased. With a final, contemptuous shove, he released Boren, who collapsed to the floor in a heap. Gasping for air, clutching his bruised throat, Kaelric turned his back on him completely, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. He faced the rest of the council, his arm once again finding its place around Celine's waist, pulling her protectively to his side. His golden eyes were cold as a winter sky. My queen has requested mercy for you, Boren. You will have it this one time, he said, his voice ringing with finality. This council is dismissed. Go back to your lands, govern your packs, and remember who your king is, and who your queen is. Should I hear so much as a whisper of disrespect toward her, from any of you, I will not send a raven. I will come myself. Without another word, he turned and guided Celine from the chamber. The alphas parted before them like a tide receding from the moon, their heads bowed, their sense a mixture of fear, resentment, and grudging awe. She had not only survived, she had, in some small, inexplicable way, won. They walked through the stone corridors in silence. Celine's mind was reeling. The sheer intensity of what had just happened left her feeling dizzy and disconnected. Kaelric's grip was firm, grounding her, his silent presence a shield against the aftershocks of the confrontation. He didn't take her back to the opulent bedchamber. Instead, he led her up a winding stone staircase, higher and higher into the central keep of the fortress. They emerged onto the battlements, the cold, clean wind whipping at them, tearing at their hair and clothes. The view was breathtaking. The fortress was perched on a sheer cliffside, overlooking a vast, dark forest that stretched to a horizon of snow-capped mountains. The world seemed to sprawl at their feet. This is what they fight for, Kaelric said, his voice low against the rushing wind. He gestured out at the wild, untamed landscape. Land, power, the right to call themselves Alpha. He turned to her, his expression serious. What you did in there was more powerful than anything I could have accomplished by snapping his neck. I was terrified, she admitted, her voice barely audible. I know, he said. He reached out, his gloved fingers gently tucking a strand of her wind-blown hair behind her ear. The simple, almost tender gesture was so at odds with the brutal violence he had just displayed that it made her heart skip a beat. Courage is not the absence of fear, Celine. It is acting in spite of it. You showed the grace of a true queen. a grace this kingdom has not seen in a very long time. She looked away from his intense gaze, out at the jagged peaks on the horizon. Ronan used to tell me my quietness was a weakness, that my lack of a wolf made me incomplete, submissive by nature. A low growl rumbled in Kelrick's chest. Ronan is a fool. He saw a still lake and thought it shallow, never realizing the depths beneath. Your stillness is not submission, it is strength in reserve. My wolf feels it. It is why he chose you. He is old and tired of the endless howling of lesser beasts. He craved the silence. The honesty in his voice was disarming. He was revealing a piece of himself, a vulnerability she never would have expected. The lonely king, pain that mirrored his own solitude. "Why did you never take a mate?" she asked softly, daring to voice the question that had defined his 50-year reign. He was silent for a moment, his gaze distant, fixed on the mountains. Because all who were offered came with a price, an alliance, a treaty, a demand. Their fathers and packs saw a mate bond as a leash to put on a king, a way to influence the throne. He looked back at her, his golden eyes raw with a pain that seemed centuries old. None of them simply saw me, the man, the wolf. They saw the crown. But you saw a stranger in a dark corner. You came to me with nothing to offer but your own brokenness, and asked for nothing but a means to survive. You were the first honest thing to happen to me in 50 years. His words struck a chord deep inside her, a place that had been silent and numb since her rejection. He wasn't just protecting her because the bond demanded it. He was protecting her because he saw her. He saw past the wolfless Omega to the person beneath. Impulsively, she reached up, her fingers tracing the line of the old scar on his cheek. He flinched almost imperceptibly at the touch, a lifetime of solitude making him unaccustomed to such casual contact. But he didn't pull away. "Who gave you this?" she asked, her voice soft. His eyes darkened with a memory. "My father," he said, his voice flat. "The Mad King, he taught me that love and power were weapons to be used against you. He was unwell." The simple, understated pain in that statement told her more than a whole saga could have. She understood now. His fortress wasn't just around his throne, it was around his heart, and she, in her blind desperation, had somehow stumbled right through the gates. He caught her hand, his fingers lacing with hers. His grip was warm, strong, possessive. The bond between them flared, no longer just a hum of power, but a gentle, warming glow that spread through her chest. It was a feeling of belonging. "Boren and the others will not accept this easily," he said, his voice returning to its regal tone, though it was now laced with a new intimacy. "They will scheme. They will look for a way to prove you are unworthy, to drive a wedge between us." "Let them," she whispered, finding the echo of his own earlier words. She looked up at him, into the depths of his molten gold eyes, and for the first time since she had walked into that tavern, she did not feel like a victim. She did not feel like a prisoner. He lowered his head, his forehead resting against hers. His scent, storm and stone and solitude, filled her senses, chasing away the last of her fears. It was the scent of safety, the scent of home. "They think you are my weakness," he murmured, his breath warm against her lips. "They are about to find out. You are my strength." And then, as the cold wind of the north whipped around them on the highest tower of his fortress, the ruthless Alpha King, who had never touched another, closed the small distance between them and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of sealing, a vow made of touch and breath, a claim staked not on a throne, but on a soul. It was the touch of grace on the scent of power, and in that moment she knew her old life was not just over. It had never even begun. The kiss was not an end, but a beginning. It was the shattering of a 50-year winter, the first crack in a fortress of ice. As Kelrick pulled back, the cold northern wind seemed to hold its breath. His golden eyes, now stripped of their regal fury and filled with a raw, wondering intensity, searched her face as if seeing it for the first time. The bond between them had shifted. It was no longer just a current of power or a hum of possession. It was a living, breathing thing, warm and luminous in the hollow of her chest. It tasted of safety. He didn't release her. His hands framed her face, his thumbs gently stroking her cheekbones. The gesture was tentative, almost reverent, as if he were touching something impossibly fragile that he was terrified of breaking. This was the man beneath the crown, the wolf beneath the king, scarred, solitary, and now irrevocably bound to her. For the first time, Celine didn't feel like a pawn in a game of power. She felt chosen. Celine, he breathed, the name a rough prayer on his lips. Before she could answer, a frantic scrabbling of footsteps on the stone stairs broke the spell. Lord Valerius appeared at the top of the stairwell, his face ashen, his robes askew, as if he'd run the whole way. He skidded to a halt, his eyes wide with a fresh terror that made his earlier fear in the council chamber look like mild concern. "Your Majesty," he gasped, bowing low, his breath coming in ragged pants. "A rider, from the south, bearing the banner of the Blackwood Pack." Celine's blood turned to ice, the warmth in her chest vanished, replaced by a familiar, sickening dread. Blackwood, Ronan. The name was a phantom pain, the ache of a limb long since amputated. Caelric's entire demeanor shifted in an instant. The nascent tenderness in his eyes was extinguished, replaced by the glacial cold of the monarch. His hands dropped from her face, one falling to the hilt of his sword, the other finding her waist and pulling her firmly back against his side. The protector, the king, was back. "He crosses my borders uninvited?" Caelric's voice was dangerously quiet. "He stopped at the border patrol, Your Majesty," Valerius stammered, avoiding Celine's gaze. "He sends a message ahead. Alpha Ronan claims his fated mate was stolen from him in a moment of weakness. He says she was taken against her will by a nameless rogue. He petitions for the Alpha King's justice. He is marching with his enforcers to reclaim what is his." The audacity of it was breathtaking. The lies were so blatant, so self-serving, they stole the air from Celine's lungs. Stolen? Reclaim what is his? She was not a lost satchel to be retrieved. He had thrown her away. He had publicly shattered their bond and declared her nothing. Now, having likely heard whispers of what had transpired, that the nameless rogue was the Alpha King, he was trying to rewrite history, to paint himself as the victim. A sound tore from Caelric's throat. It was not a human sound. It was a low, guttural snarl of a predator whose territory had been brazenly challenged. The very air around him seemed to thicken, to shimmer with rage. Valerius took an involuntary step back, his hand flying to the dagger at his belt in a useless gesture of self-preservation. "He will march to his grave," Caelric growled, his golden eyes beginning to glow with that terrifying feral light. "Send the legions to the southern border. I want his head and the heads of his enforcers on pikes before the sun sets." No, the word escaped Celine's lips before she even realized she was speaking. Caelric looked down at her, his expression a thunderous mask of confusion and rage. "He is a liar and a dog," Caelric snarled. "He humiliated you. He cast you out. Now he seeks to use you as a pawn to gain an audience with me. He will die for his arrogance." "And what will that prove?" she asked, her voice shaking but clear. "That you are a possessive alpha, just like him? That I am a thing to be fought over, a prize to be won, or a territory to be conquered? His lies will become truth in the whispers of the other packs. They will say you stole me, that you killed him out of jealousy. They will say you are ruled by your appetites, not your mind." She saw the logic of her words pierce through his rage. He was a king before he was an alpha, a strategist before he was a warrior. He had survived 50 years on this throne by being more cunning than his enemies. His fury did not vanish, but it was banked, controlled, sharpened to a finer point. He studied her, his gaze intense. "What do you propose?" "Let him come," she said, the words tasting like poison. "Let him stand before you and make his claim. Let him speak his lies not just to you, but to me, in front of witnesses. Let the truth be heard from my lips, not just yours." She took a shuddering breath. "I will not hide behind your throne, Caelric. I will not be the silent, trembling prize." He made his rejection public. Let my rejection of him be just as loud. A slow, dangerous smile spread across Caelric's face. It was not a smile of warmth, but of a predator seeing a far more satisfying way to destroy its prey. He looked at Valerius. His command, absolute. Send a raven back to the border patrol. Grant Alpha Ronan and a delegation of no more than 5 of his wolves safe passage to the fortress. They are to be disarmed at the gates and escorted to the Great Hall. They will have their audience at dawn. Your Majesty, Valerius breathed, his face a mixture of shock and relief. He bowed deeply and practically fled down the stairs to carry out the order. Kaelric turned back to Celine, his large hands coming to rest on her shoulders. His gaze was searching, probing the depths of her eyes. This will not be easy. He will try to wound you with his words. He knows your fears. He was the one who planted them there, she whispered. A tear she hadn't realized was forming, finally tracing a cold path down her cheek. She hated the weakness of it, hated that Ronan still had the power to make her cry. Calric's thumb came up to brush the tear away, his touch surprisingly gentle. Then we will rip them out by the roots. He guided her away from the battlements, leading her not to the royal bedchamber, but to a smaller, more intimate room. It was a study, lined with shelves of books and maps. A fire roared in the hearth, and 2 large, worn leather chairs were set before it. It felt like his private sanctuary, the heart of the man rather than the king. He sat her in one of the chairs and knelt before her, taking her cold hands in his. "Tell me everything," he commanded softly. "Leave out no detail, no insult, no moment of shame. I will be your armor tomorrow, Celine. But armor must be forged to fit the wearer. I need to know the shape of your pain." And so she told him. The words came in a torrent at first, then a slow, painful trickle. She told him about the years of whispers, the pitying looks, the quiet isolation of being a wolfless Omega in a pack that valued primal strength above all else. She told him of the fragile hope Ronan had represented, the promise of the mate bond that was supposed to make everything right. She recounted the public humiliation at the bonfire, the scent of Lyra's perfume on him, the cold, dead look in his eyes. She spoke the words he had used to cast her aside. Wolfless, barren, nothing. With every word she felt the fury coiling inside Kaelric. He did not speak, but his jaw tightened, the muscles in his forearms bunching as he held her hands. The bond between them became a conduit for his rage, but it was a rage directed entirely outward, a shield of fury that surrounded her. When she finished, her voice a raw whisper, the room was silent save for the crackling of the fire. He let go of one of her hands and reached up, his fingers gently tracing the intricate raised mark on her neck, his mark. "He branded you with his words," he murmured, his voice thick with a controlled violence. "He tried to define you by what you lacked. But a true alpha does not see what is missing. He sees what is there." His golden eyes held hers, fierce and unwavering. "He called you wolfless, but I see a spirit that could not be broken. He called you barren, but I see a heart with the strength to mother a new age for this kingdom. He called you nothing, and in his blindness, he threw away everything." He stood, pulling her to her feet. He led her to a large silver-gilt mirror that hung on one wall. He stood behind her, his hands on her shoulders, forcing her to look at their reflection. At the towering, powerful king and the small, slender woman who somehow looked right standing in his shadow. "When he looks at you tomorrow, he will expect to see the broken Omega he discarded," Kaelric said, his voice a low rumble in her ear. "He will not find her. She is gone." His hand moved from her shoulder, his fingers tracing the bond mark on her neck again. "This is not a collar of ownership, Celine. It is a crown. It is the symbol of my choice. He will come expecting to see a slave. He will find a queen." His words, his belief in her, were a balm on wounds she thought were fatal. She looked at her own reflection, at the fear still lingering in her eyes, and for the first time, saw a flicker of the woman he described. The night passed in a blur of tension. Celine did not sleep. Kaelric stayed with her in the study, sitting in the opposite chair, watching over her as the fire burned down to glowing embers. He did not press her to talk more, but his silent, unwavering presence was a comfort more profound than any words. As the first gray light of dawn began to creep through the arrow-slit windows, a guard's knock echoed at the door. "Your Majesty, the delegation from the Blackwood Pack has arrived. They are in the Great Hall." Kaelric rose, every inch the king. He wore the same black armored tunic as the day before, his sword at his hip. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Are you ready?" Celine took a deep breath, the cold morning air filling her lungs. She thought of Ronan's sneer, of Lyra's triumphant smile, of the pack turning their backs on her. And then she thought of Kaelric's fury, of his kiss on the battlements, of his voice calling her his queen. She looked him in the eye. Yes. Together they walked to the great hall. The doors swung open, and she saw them. Ronan stood in the center of the hall, flanked by 4 of his largest enforcers. He looked arrogant, confident, his handsome face set in a look of performative concern. He had dressed in his finest leathers, trying to project a power he simply didn't possess in this place of true authority. His eyes found her, and for a fraction of a second, his confident mask slipped. He had expected to see her in chains, or perhaps dressed as a servant. He did not expect to see her walking at the Alpha King's side, unbound, dressed in fine wool, her head held high. He certainly did not expect to see the intricate, glowing mark of a royal bond proudly displayed on her neck. His gaze flickered from the mark to Kaelric's possessive hand on her waist, and his face paled. The color drained from his cheeks as the full, catastrophic reality of his miscalculation crashed down upon him. He had not come to reclaim a broken Omega from a nameless rogue. He had come to the dragon's lair to demand the return of the dragon's most prized treasure, and the dragon was watching him with hungry, golden eyes. The great hall was a vast, echoing cavern of stone and shadow. Designed to intimidate, sunlight struggled through high, narrow windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like restless spirits. Banners bearing the snarling wolf's head of House Daemar hung from the rafters, silent, ancient witnesses to 100 generations of royal judgment. At the far end of the hall, on a raised dais, sat a throne carved from the black, petrified heartwood of a lightning-scarred oak. It was empty. Kaelric did not sit. He stood at the foot of the dais, a mountain of quiet, coiled fury, with Selene held firmly at his side. Ronan stared, his handsome face a canvas of disbelief shifting to dawning horror. This was not how he had envisioned this. In his mind, he would make a noble, impassioned plea. The reclusive king, who had never shown interest in a mate, would surely see the justice in returning a lowly Omega to her rightful, fated Alpha. He would be rewarded for his piety, for upholding the sacredness of fated bonds. He had not anticipated the glowing, possessive mark on her neck. He had not anticipated the look in Kaelric's eyes, a look that promised not justice, but a slow, methodical annihilation. "Alpha Ronan of the Blackwood," Kaelric's voice boomed, the sound echoing off the cold stone. It was not a greeting. It was the tolling of a bell. "You requested an audience. You stand in our hall. You have it. State your claim." Ronan swallowed, his bravado visibly crumbling. His enforcers shifted their weight nervously, their eyes darting from their alpha to the silent, imposing figure of the king. They could smell the sheer, overwhelming dominance in the air, a crushing pressure that made the fur on their own necks prickle. Finding a sliver of his rehearsed arrogance, Ronan puffed out his chest. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice strained, "I have come a great distance to seek your renowned justice. My fated mate, Selene Marrow, was abducted from my territory 2 nights ago. In a moment of confusion and grief following a minor disagreement, she fled into the neutral lands. I believe she was taken from there, against her will, by a rogue who sought to use her against me." He dared to look at Selene then, attempting to infuse his gaze with a look of pained longing, a silent plea for her to play her part. "Selene, my love, it is over. You are safe now. Tell the king what happened. Tell him you were forced." The words were so steeped in lies, they were almost laughable. Selene felt a tremor of her old fear, the instinct to avoid confrontation, to simply fade into the background. But Kaelric's hand on the small of her back was a warm, steady pressure, a silent command to be brave. She thought of his words. He will expect to see a slave. He will find a queen. She took a step forward, deliberately breaking contact with Kaelric, standing on her own. The movement was small, but it was a declaration. She would not hide behind him. "There was no abduction, Ronan," she said, her voice clear and cold, ringing with a confidence that stunned him into silence. She saw his shock, the slight widening of his eyes as he heard her speak with a strength he had never known she possessed. "There was no confusion, and our disagreement was not minor." She turned her head slightly, giving him a clear view of the bond mark on her neck. "And the man you call a rogue is my Alpha, my king, The bond between us was not forced. It was sought. It was offered. And it was accepted. A collective gasp came from Ronan's enforcers. Ronan himself looked as if she had physically struck him. "Sought!" he choked out, his face flushing with a dark, ugly red. You worthless, wolfless bitch? You would profane the fated bond for a night with a stranger?" Before the last word had left his mouth, a low, predatory growl ripped through the hall, a sound so primal and full of menace that Ronan's enforcers instinctively took a step back, their hands flying to the empty sheaths at their belts. Calric took a step forward, his golden eyes blazing, the beast within him clawing at the surface. "Wait," Celine said, putting a hand on his chest, stopping him. The muscle beneath her palm was rigid as stone. She could feel the violent thrum of his wolf, begging for release. "This is my truth to speak, not yours to avenge. Not yet." Calric looked down at her, a battle raging in his eyes. He gave a slow, reluctant nod, his jaw tight. Celine turned back to Ronan, her gaze unwavering. "You speak of the fated bond? You who dishonored it in the woods with another she-wolf? You who shattered it before our entire pack? Calling me barren and nothing? You nullified that bond, Ronan. You burned that bridge. And I, in my desperation, simply found another way to cross the river." "Lyra meant nothing," Ronan insisted, his voice rising in desperation as he saw his narrative unraveling. "It was a moment of foolishness. A true mate would have forgiven me." "A true alpha would not have needed forgiveness for such a crime," she retorted, her voice sharp as glass. "He would never have committed it in the first place." The truth of her words hung in the air, stark and undeniable. Ronan was left sputtering, his lies exposed, his carefully constructed victimhood collapsing around him. He was no noble alpha seeking justice. He was a philanderer and a fool who had thrown away a mate, only to realize too late that he had discarded something of immense value to a far greater power. His greed, not his heart, had brought him here. "I reject your claim," Calric's voice cut through the tension, each word a hammer blow. "The she-wolf Celine was packless, bondless, and free when she came to me. Our bond is recognized under the old law. She is mine. She is Queen of the North." He looked at Ronan, his gaze filled with a cold, absolute contempt. "You came here seeking justice, and justice you shall have. You publicly humiliated and disavowed your fated mate. For this, you will make recompense. You will cede the southern hunting grounds of your territory, from the Whispering River to the Stone Ridge to the Crown. A tithe for the pain you caused her." Ronan's jaw dropped. The southern grounds were the richest in his territory, the heart of his pack's prosperity. To lose them would be a crippling blow, a sign of unforgivable weakness. "You cannot," he exclaimed. "That is a quarter of my lands. My pack would starve." "They should have thought of that when they turned their backs on one of their own," Calric said, his voice devoid of pity. "Furthermore, you will make a public apology. You will send a decree to every pack in the north, recanting your insults. You will state that Celine Marrow is not wolfless in spirit, and that your rejection was an error of your own weakness, not any failing of hers. This was worse than losing the land. It was the complete and utter destruction of his pride, his reputation. He would be a laughingstock. The alpha who had been cuckolded by a king and then forced to grovel. "I will not," Ronan snarled, his desperation finally boiling over into a foolish, suicidal rage. "I will not be humiliated by this barren whore." The world exploded. Calric moved, a blur of shadow and death. He did not draw his sword. He didn't need it. His hand, which just moments before had been a comforting weight on Celine's back, shot out and seized Ronan by the face. With a roar of pure, untamed fury, he lifted Ronan from his feet and slammed him onto the great stone floor. The crack of bone and stone echoed through the hall. Ronan's enforcers, seeing their alpha so brutally dispatched, finally broke. With cries of terror, they drew their hidden boot knives, a grave insult, to draw steel in the king's hall, and charged. They didn't get 5 feet. From the shadows along the walls, the royal guard emerged. They were not the ceremonial guards from the corridors. These were the elite, the king's personal executioners. Clad in black, silent armor, their faces hidden behind wolf-visored helms, they moved with a silent, lethal grace. Steel rang, and the fight was over before it had truly begun. The four enforcers lay dead or dying on the cold stone, dispatched with ruthless efficiency. Celine stared, her hand over her mouth, her heart pounding. Kaelric stood over Ronan's broken form. Ronan was still alive, but barely, a whimpering, bloody mess on the floor. Kaelric had not killed him. He had simply broken him. He looked down at the pathetic Alpha, his golden eyes glowing with a cold, terrifying light. "You were warned," he growled. "You were offered mercy. You were given a path to walk away with your life. You chose this." He turned to Celine, his expression softening almost imperceptibly as he looked at her. He held out his hand. "This is not your justice to witness. Come." She took his hand, her fingers trembling as they laced with his. He led her from the great hall, leaving the royal guard to clean up the mess of blood and broken pride. He led her back to the battlements, to the cold, clean air where he had first kissed her. She was shaking, not from fear, but from the aftershock of the violence, the sheer, brutal finality of it all. "You could have killed him," she whispered. "Death is an easy escape," Kaelric said, his voice a low rumble. He guided her to the stone parapet, standing behind her, his arms wrapping around her in a protective embrace. "He will live. He will return to his pack, broken and humiliated. He will lose his lands. He will be forced to send out the decree, praising the woman he scorned. Every day for the rest of his miserable life, he will wake up knowing that the nothing he threw away is now a queen, and that her name is spoken with more reverence than his will ever be. That is a far crueler punishment than a quick death. That is justice." She leaned back against his solid chest, drawing strength from his warmth, from the steady beat of his heart against her back. The wind whipped her hair around her face, and for the first time, it didn't feel cold, it felt clean, it felt like freedom. The shadows of her past, the ghost of Ronan, the shame of her rejection, they were not just gone. They had been exorcised with fire and steel. Kaelric hadn't just protected her, he had scoured her past clean, leaving only the future, their future. "It's over," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "No," he murmured, his lips brushing against her hair. "It is just beginning." He turned her in his arms, his golden gaze intense and serious. "Ronan was a symptom. The disease is the old way of thinking, the prejudice against those who are different. Bourne and the others still believe you are a weakness. We have dealt with the pup who yapped at our heels. Now we must deal with the old wolves who are still plotting in the shadows." He cupped her face, his gaze burning into hers. "I am going to make you so strong, so revered, that they will have no choice but to bow to you. Not out of fear of me, but out of respect for you. You are more than just my mate, Celine. You are the key to changing everything." The weeks that followed were a crucible. Kaelric's words on the battlements had not been a lover's empty promise. They were the strategic outline of a king. He was not content to merely shield her. He intended to arm her. Her education began not in the soft arts of a queen, tapestry, and courtly dance, but in the harsh realities of power. Her days were filled with a relentless schedule he designed himself. Mornings were spent in the royal library, a towering circular chamber filled with the collected knowledge of 1,000 years. With Lord Valerius as her reluctant but dutiful tutor, she studied the histories of the great packs, their bloodlines, their ancient treaties, their long-held grudges. She learned the laws of the North, both the written codes of the monarchy and the unwritten primal laws of the wolves. She discovered that Kaelric's father, the Mad King, had nearly destroyed the kingdom by favoring pureblood alphas, leading to decades of bitter infighting and weakness. Kaelric's 50-year reign had been a long, brutal process of stitching the fractured territories back together through sheer force of will. He had created a fragile peace, but the old prejudices, the belief in blood purity that had condemned her, were still simmering just beneath the surface. Afternoons were spent with Kaelric himself. He took her not to the throne room, but to the map room, the strategic heart of the fortress. It was a vast chamber dominated by a table, carved with a perfect topographical representation of the entire northern continent. He taught her strategy, moving carved wooden wolves across the map to represent packs and armies. He showed her the importance of supply lines, the weaknesses of his rivals, the delicate balance of power he maintained. "Lord Boren's Frostfang pack controls the northern passes," he explained one afternoon, his finger tracing a line through a formidable mountain range on the map. He grows wealthy by taxing every merchant and traveler, but his people are overstretched, his warriors arrogant. They are a hammer looking for a nail. A hammer is useless against the wind. He looked at her, his golden eyes intense. Power is not always about strength. Often it is about knowing where your enemy is weak. He was teaching her to think like him, to see the world not as a collection of people, but as a complex web of alliances, ambitions, and vulnerabilities. He was giving her the tools to rule, but it was the evenings that changed her most profoundly. Calric took her to the sparring yards, where the royal guard trained. At first she merely watched, horrified and fascinated by the brutal, beautiful dance of combat. But one evening he drew her into the center of the dusty arena. "You do not have a wolf's strength," he said, pressing a slender, perfectly balanced dagger into her hand. The hilt was cool and smooth against her palm. "You will not win a fight through brute force, but you have a wolf's spirit. You have speed, you have a keen mind, and you have the will to survive. That is more than enough." Under his patient, demanding tutelage, she began to learn. He taught her how to hold the blade, how to use an opponent's weight against them, where to strike for maximum effect. He was a terrifyingly graceful fighter, moving with a fluid power that was breathtaking to behold. He never once hurt her, his control absolute, but he never went easy on her either. He forced her to learn, to anticipate, to fight back. And in the sweat and dust of the training yard, something inside her began to shift. The timid, fearful Omega was being flayed away, revealing a core of tempered steel beneath. The bond between them deepened with every passing day. It was a constant, living presence, a silent conversation running beneath the surface of their lives. She felt his frustrations during council meetings, the heavy weight of the crown he wore. He, in turn, felt her small triumphs. The first time she correctly identified a pack's political weakness, the first time she disarmed a training partner. Their nights were spent in his chambers, but not as she might have expected. They would talk for hours by the fire, sharing stories, fears, and dreams. He slept on a pallet of furs on the floor, giving her the massive bed, a gesture of respect so profound it touched her more than any caress. He was courting her, not as an alpha claiming a mate, but as a man earning a woman's trust. He was waiting for her. The news of Ronan's humiliation spread like wildfire. A copy of his decree, written in his own hand, arrived at the fortress and was posted in the great hall for all to see. In it, he recanted his every insult, praising Celine's strength of spirit, blaming his own weakness for their broken bond. As Calric had predicted, Ronan became a cautionary tale, a laughingstock. The ceded lands were absorbed into the royal domain, their resources used to bolster the patrols along the southern border. The Blackwood pack was diminished, humbled. But Boren and the other conservative alphas were not so easily silenced. They did not challenge Calric openly, but a subtle campaign of whispers and rumors began. They spoke of the king's obsession, of how the wolfless queen was making him soft. They whispered that an Omega, who could not produce a true-blooded alpha heir, would be the end of the Daymar dynasty and the security of the North. The final confrontation came during the Harvest Moon Festival, a sacred time when the pack alphas brought their tithes to the capital and renewed their vows of fealty. The great hall was filled to capacity, no longer tense and empty, but crowded with the full panoply of the northern court. Alphas and their mates, dressed in their finest furs and leathers, filled the benches. Braziers burned brightly, casting a warm, festive glow over the scene. Celine stood beside the throne, not behind it. Calric had insisted. She wore a gown of deep forest green, the color of her eyes, embroidered with the silver thread of the royal house. On her neck, no longer a mark of shame or desperation, but a badge of honor, the bond mark seemed to glow with a soft light of its own. She met the gazes of the assembled alphas, her head held high. She saw the surprise in their eyes, the grudging respect from some, the veiled hostility from others. One by one, the alphas came forward to present their tithes and renew their vows. When Lord Boren of the Frostfang pack stepped forward, a palpable tension fell over the hall. He bowed stiffly, his eyes avoiding Celine's. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice a low growl, "I bring the tithes of the Frostfang and renew my vow of loyalty to the throne." "The throne accepts your vow, Lord Boren," Calric said, his voice cool. But Boren did not step back. He straightened up, his gaze sweeping the hall, a politician playing to his audience. Majesty, the harvest moon is also a time of concern for the future, for the continuation of our strong bloodlines. For 50 years, we have had a king, but a kingdom needs an heir, a true-blooded alpha heir to secure the future of the North. The challenge was laid bare. It was a direct public attack on Celine's greatest perceived weakness, her supposed barrenness. The hall erupted in murmurs. This was the moment the dissenters had been waiting for. Celine felt a familiar, cold dread wash over her. This was the one wound she didn't know how to fight, the biological reality of her wolfless state. But before Kaelric could unleash the furious tirade she saw building in his eyes, Celine held up a hand, a quiet, simple gesture that somehow commanded silence. She stepped forward, descending the 2 steps from the dais to stand on the same level as Boren. "You speak of bloodlines, Lord Boren," she said, her voice calm and clear, carrying to every corner of the hall. "You speak of the strength of the wolf. For my entire life, I have been judged by the wolf I do not have. You see me as a hollow vessel." She looked not at Boren, but at the faces in the crowd, the powerful alphas, their mates, their warriors. "You believe that strength is only born from an alpha womb. You cling to the old ways, the very ways that allowed the Mad King to tear this kingdom apart. You believe in the purity of blood, but our king," she said, turning to look up at Kaelric, her voice filled with a love and reverence that was undeniable, "has spent 50 years proving that true strength lies not in blood, but in will, not in lineage, but in leadership." She turned back to Boren, her gaze now sharp as her dagger. "You worry about an heir? You think the future of the North rests in the womb of its queen? You are mistaken. The future of the North rests in its unity. It rests in abandoning the foolish prejudices that have kept us fighting amongst ourselves for generations. It rests in accepting that strength comes in many forms." She took a deep breath, steeling herself for her final, irreversible gambit. "You see me as barren, but the old magic that binds me to your king is far more ancient than your petty concerns over blood. It is a magic of spirit, not of flesh." As she spoke, she focused her will, reaching deep inside herself to the bond, to the well of power Kaelric had shared with her. It was a terrifying, instinctive act. She pulled on that power, not for strength, but for something more. She felt a surge, a searing heat that started in the mark on her neck and flooded her entire being. Her eyes began to glow. It was not the fierce molten gold of Kaelric's wolf, but a soft, luminous silver, like the light of the full moon itself. The light grew, bathing the dais in an ethereal glow. A collective gasp swept the hall. Even Kaelric stared, his expression one of pure, unadulterated awe. The silver light coalesced, and for a fleeting, impossible moment, the spectral image of a great wolf, made of pure moonlight, shimmered into existence behind her. It was vast, ancient, and powerful, its silver eyes filled with a wisdom that transcended time. It was her spirit, her wolf, the one that had been sleeping inside her all along, awakened by a bond not of fate, but of choice, of love. "The goddess does not make mistakes, Lord Boren," Celine said, her voice now resonating with a faint, otherworldly echo. "She does not create hollow vessels. She merely waits for a soul worthy enough to see the strength within." The spectral wolf faded, and the silver light in her eyes receded, leaving her standing there, trembling slightly from the effort, but resolute. The hall was utterly, profoundly silent. Lord Boren stared at her, his face a mask of shock and superstitious terror. He had challenged a queen and been answered by a goddess. He dropped to his knees, his forehead touching the cold stone floor. "Your Majesty," he whispered, his voice choked with awe. "Forgive me." One by one, throughout the great hall, the other alphas, the doubters, the schemers, the loyalists, all sank to their knees. They did not bow to Kaelric. They bowed to her. Kaelric descended the dais, his eyes, those beautiful molten gold eyes, shining with a fierce pride and a love so profound it stole her breath. He took her hand, his grip warm and steady, and raised it for all to see. "Behold your queen," he roared, his voice filled with a triumphant joy that shook the very foundations of the fortress. "The Alpha is the strength of the pack, but the Omega is its heart, and our heart is strong." The assembled wolves of the north, their heads still bowed, let out a single unified howl of fealty. It was a sound not of submission, but of celebration. A sound of a new age being born. An age not of blood, but of spirit. An age of the wolfless queen. 5 years passed, seasons turning like pages in a well-loved book. The north changed. The harsh winds still blew from the frozen spine, and the snows of winter were still deep and merciless. But the soul of the kingdom had found a new warmth, a new center. The whispers against the wolfless queen had long since died, replaced by legends. They called her Selene the Wise, the moon-blessed, the queen of spirit. Her reign, at Kelric's side, was not one of conquest or command, but of connection. She traveled with him across their vast domain, not just to the keeps of the great alphas, but to the small, forgotten villages and nomadic packs that scratched out a living in the harsh wilderness. She listened. Where Kelric ruled with the unyielding strength of the mountain, she governed with the patient, life-giving persistence of the river that carves its way through stone. She established trade routes, mediated ancient disputes, and created a system where even the lowest-born shifter had a voice that could reach the throne. The old prejudices began to crumble, not under the force of a king's decree, but under the gentle, irrefutable evidence of a queen's grace. The fortress, once a place of cold, masculine power, had also transformed. Herbs and flowers now grew in the high-walled courtyards, their scents mingling with the stone and steel. The laughter of children, wards of the court, orphans of border skirmishes, whom Selene had taken under her protection, often echoed in the halls that had once known only the tread of armored boots. It was a home. Selene stood on the battlements where Kelric had first kissed her, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the land. The wind, once a cold and hostile force, was now a familiar friend, weaving through her hair, which was now threaded with a few strands of silver of its own. She was no longer the frail, broken girl who had fled into the night. Her quietness remained, but it was now the quiet of a deep, still lake, confident in its own depths. A pair of strong arms wrapped around her from behind, and a familiar, beloved scent of storm and stone enveloped her. Kelric rested his chin on her shoulder, his own dark hair now more silver than black. The lines around his eyes etched deeper, not by worry, but by the rare and welcome habit of smiling. "You are looking at the horizon again," he murmured, his voice a low, contented rumble against her ear. "Are you plotting to annex the southern kingdoms, my love?" She smiled, leaning back against his solid warmth. "No, just admiring our world." She tilted her head, her gaze falling on the training yard below. 2 figures were sparring, their movements a blur of youthful energy. One was a tall, rangy boy of 16, Lyall, the alpha-born son of one of Kelric's guards, orphaned in a rogue attack. The other was a girl, barely 14, small for her age, but impossibly quick. Her name was Kira, a wolfless omega discovered on the brink of starvation after being cast out from a pack in Boren's territory. A pack the old lord, now fiercely loyal, had personally and brutally disbanded for their cruelty. Selene had taken Kira in, seeing a reflection of her own past, and Kira was winning. She ducked under Lyall's clumsy lunge, used his momentum to throw him off balance, and had her wooden training dagger pressed to his throat before he hit the ground. She helped him up with a grin, and he clapped her on the shoulder, a gesture of pure respect between warriors. "She has your spirit," Kelric said, his voice thick with pride. "And your grace. She will be captain of your queen's guard one day." "She will be whatever she chooses to be," Selene corrected gently. "That is the north we have built. A place where worth is measured by will, not by birth." Kelric turned her in his arms, his golden eyes softer now than they had been in a lifetime, searching hers. The bond between them was a silent, effortless symphony, a constant source of strength and comfort. The fiery passion of their early days had mellowed into a deep, abiding love that was the bedrock of their lives and their kingdom. "I was a king of stone and shadow before you came," he said, his voice raw with an emotion he now showed freely, at least to her. "I ruled a kingdom, but I did not have a home. You gave me that. You gave this land a heart." She reached up, her hand tracing the old scar on his cheek, a gesture that had become a familiar sign of her affection. "And you gave a ghost a voice. You saw a queen when all I saw was a survivor." They stood in comfortable silence for a long moment, watching the sun dip below the distant, snow-capped peaks, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet. The first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. "They are waiting for you," Kelric said softly. Celine nodded. She took his hand, and together they walked from the battlements, down the winding stairs, and toward the great hall. It was the night of the full moon, and as had become their tradition, the throne was left empty. The hall was filled not with grim-faced alphas, but with the people of the fortress, guards, servants, children, stable hands, all gathered. In the center of the hall, a space had been cleared. Celine stepped into the center of the room, into a single shaft of moonlight that fell from a high window. She closed her eyes, and as she had done so many times now, she reached for the power inside her. It answered her call not like a summoned weapon, but like a beloved partner in a dance. The silver light bloomed from within her, soft and ethereal. Her eyes opened, glowing with the serene light of the moon, and behind her, the spectral form of her spirit wolf shimmered into existence. It was larger now, more defined, its presence a silent, powerful comfort that filled the hall. The people watched in reverent silence, not in fear, but in wonder. This was not a display of power to cow them into submission. This was a communion. Celine's wolf was not a beast of war like Kelric's. It was a creature of wisdom and empathy. Its silent silver gaze seemed to touch each person in the hall, to see their hardships, to acknowledge their hopes. Through Celine, it offered a blessing of peace, a promise of belonging, the Omega's gift, to nurture, to connect, to make the pack a whole. From his place by the wall, Kelric watched her, his heart full. He was still the Alpha King, the unchallenged warrior who would burn the world to protect what was his. But he was also just a wolf who had found his mate, a lonely man who had found his solace. He had thought, in his blind arrogance, that he had rescued her. He knew now that she, in her quiet, unyielding grace, had been the one to rescue him. When the ritual was done, the silver light faded, and Celine was herself again, a woman standing in the moonlight. The people of her court surged forward, not with the formality of subjects, but with the warmth of a family, surrounding her with thanks and well wishes. She listened to each of them, her hand on a child's head, a kind word for an old cook, a nod of respect to a young guard. Later, as the moon climbed high into the sky, they were alone again in their chambers. The fire crackled in the hearth, a mirror to the quiet, steady fire that burned between them. Celine sat before it, brushing her hair, while Kelric stood by the window, watching the moon-drenched landscape. "No regrets?" she asked softly, her eyes meeting his in the reflection of the window pane. He turned, a slow smile gracing his lips. He walked to her, taking the brush from her hand and setting it aside. He knelt before her, as he had done on that first day in his study, taking her hands in his. "My only regret," he said, his voice a low, sincere vow, "is that I wasted 50 years on a throne of stone, when I could have been building a throne of moonlight with you." He leaned in and kissed her, a kiss that held the memory of every trial they had faced, every battle they had won, every quiet moment they had shared. It was a kiss of equals, of partners, of two souls who had been shattered by life and then forged together into something stronger and more beautiful than either could have been alone. She was Celine Desmar. She was not wolfless. She was the heart of the wolf. She was not barren. She was the mother of a new age. She was not nothing. She was and would always be his everything. And in the heart of the unforgiving north, under the light of the eternal moon, the queen and her king had finally, truly, come home.